Lee Harvey Oswald. On November 24, 1963, 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald was being transferred from Dallas City Jail to the county facility. 2 days earlier, Oswald had allegedly assassinated President John F. Kennedy while the motorcade passed through Dealey Plaza. The former Marine had been captured in a movie theater hours after the shooting and charged with murdering both the president and a Dallas police officer. By Sunday morning, the entire nation was watching. News cameras had been granted unprecedented access to broadcast the prisoner transfer live on national television. Millions of Americans tuned in to see the accused assassin being moved. Around 11:20 a.m., Oswald emerged from the basement jail, wearing a dark sweater, flanked by detectives. As cameras rolled and flashbulbs popped, a man suddenly lunged forward from the crowd of reporters. Jack Ruby, a 52-year-old Dallas nightclub owner, pushed through with a .38 revolver. Ruby fired a single shot into Oswald's abdomen at point-blank range. Oswald grimaced and doubled over as officers immediately tackled Ruby. The shooting happened in full view of television cameras, broadcasting to the entire country. Oswald was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the same facility where President Kennedy had died 2 days earlier. Surgeons operated for nearly 2 hours, but the bullet had caused massive internal damage to Oswald's spleen, stomach, liver, and kidney. Lee Harvey Oswald died at 1:07 p.m., never standing trial for assassinating the president. Ruby claimed he shot Oswald to spare Jackie Kennedy the pain of testifying at trial. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, though the conviction was later overturned. Ruby died of cancer before a new trial could begin. The assassination of an assassin on live television became one of the most famous moments in broadcast history. Oswald's death fueled decades of conspiracy theories and left many questions unresolved in the public mind. John Wilkes Booth. On April 26, 1865, 26-year-old John Wilkes Booth was cornered inside a tobacco barn on the Garrett Farm in rural Virginia. Booth, a famous stage actor who had earned substantial income performing in theaters across the country, had assassinated President Abraham Lincoln 12 days earlier at Ford's Theater. He had fled Washington with accomplice David Harold, spending nearly 2 weeks evading capture, while his broken leg, sustained jumping from the presidential box, caused him constant agony. Federal troops had tracked Booth and Harold to the barn. Around 2 a.m., soldiers surrounded the structure and demanded surrender. Harold gave himself up, but Booth refused. He shouted that he would not be taken alive and challenged the soldiers to come fight him. The commander ordered the barn set on fire to force Booth out. As flames spread through the dry tobacco barn, Booth moved toward the door with a carbine rifle and pistol. Through gaps in the wooden slats, Sergeant Boston Corbett spotted Booth illuminated by firelight. Corbett fired his revolver through the slats. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spinal cord and paralyzing him instantly. Soldiers rushed into the burning barn and dragged Booth out onto the porch of the farmhouse. He was paralyzed from the neck down and struggling to breathe. For nearly 3 hours, Booth lay dying on the porch. He asked soldiers to lift his hands so he could see them. He stared at his paralyzed hands and whispered his final words, "Useless, useless." John Wilkes Booth died at 7:15 a.m. His body was taken to Washington and secretly buried beneath a prison floor to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. The government refused to return his remains to his family for years, fearing Southern sympathizers would memorialize him. Charlotte Corday. On July 17, 1793, 24-year-old Charlotte Corday was executed by guillotine in Paris's Place de la Révolution. 4 days earlier, Corday had stabbed revolutionary leader Jean-Paul Marat to death in his bathtub. The young woman from Normandy had traveled to Paris specifically to kill Marat, whom she blamed for the Reign of Terror's worst excesses. She had been immediately arrested, tried by the Revolutionary Tribunal, and sentenced to death. Thousands gathered to watch her execution. Corday rode to the guillotine in an open cart, reportedly calm and composed despite the hostile crowd. She wore a red shirt, the garment worn by those condemned for assassinating revolutionaries. Around 7 p.m., Corday climbed the scaffold steps. The executioner positioned her beneath the blade. The guillotine's heavy blade fell, severing her head cleanly. What happened next became one of history's most debated moments. The executioner's assistant, a man named Legros, lifted Corday's severed head by the hair and slapped it across the cheek to demonstrate contempt. Multiple witnesses, including the executioner himself, later testified that Corday's face appeared to blush red after the slap, and her eyes seemed to look at her tormentor with an expression of indignation. The crowd reacted with shock and horror. News of the head's apparent reaction spread through Paris and beyond. The incident sparked scientific debate that continued for over a century about whether consciousness could remain briefly after decapitation. Medical experts studied the phenomenon, with some arguing the facial changes were merely muscular reflexes, while others insisted they indicated remaining awareness. Legros was arrested and imprisoned for 3 months for the disrespectful act. Corday's execution and the controversy surrounding her severed head's reaction became a famous episode of revolutionary France, discussed in medical journals and philosophical treatises for generations. Charles Guiteau. On June 30, 1882, 40-year-old Charles Guiteau was executed by hanging in Washington, D.C. Guiteau had shot President James A. Garfield the previous year at a train station, believing God had commanded him to kill the president. Garfield had died months later from infections related to the wound and the doctor's unsanitary treatment methods. Guiteau's trial had been a spectacle, with the defendant acting bizarrely and claiming insanity. He had been convicted and sentenced to death. On execution day, Guiteau displayed no fear. He practically danced up the gallows steps, waving cheerfully to the assembled crowd and officials. He had spent his final days writing a poem titled, "I Am Going to the Lordy," which he believed would become famous. Before the noose was placed around his neck, Gito requested permission to recite his poem. He delivered it in a strange, high-pitched, childlike voice, swaying as he spoke. The poem compared his impending death to a child going to sleep. After finishing his recitation, Gito dropped the paper as his signal to the executioners. The trapdoor opened. Gito fell and died by hanging. His body was taken down and buried in the jail cemetery. But his death was not the end of his story. Prison officials had secretly arranged for doctors to remove Gito's brain for study. Medical professionals wanted to examine the brain of a man who claimed divine inspiration for murder. Gito's brain was preserved for study and remains in medical collections today. The preserved brain shows no obvious abnormalities, leaving the question of Gito's sanity unresolved even in death. Leon Czolgosz. On October 29, 1901, 28-year-old Leon Czolgosz was executed by electric chair at Auburn Prison in New York. Czolgosz had shot President William McKinley at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo 7 weeks earlier, claiming he killed the president because McKinley was the enemy of the good people. McKinley had died from gangrene 8 days after the shooting. Czolgosz's trial lasted only 8.5 hours, including jury deliberation. He showed no remorse and offered no defense. The execution was scheduled quickly. At 7:12 a.m., Czolgosz was led into the execution chamber and strapped into the electric chair. His last words were brief and unrepentant. "I killed the president because he was the enemy of the good people, the good working people. I am not sorry for my crime." Executioners delivered 1,800 volts through his body for 45 seconds. Leon Czolgosz died in the electric chair. What authorities did next was extraordinary. The government wanted absolutely no trace of Czolgosz to remain. They feared his grave could become a shrine for anarchists and radicals. Prison officials refused to release the body to his family. Instead, they placed Czolgosz's corpse in a plain pine coffin and carried it to the prison cemetery. Then they poured sulfuric acid over the entire body. The acid was so concentrated that it reportedly dissolved Czolgosz's body completely within 12 hours, leaving only skeletal fragments. Even his clothes and the coffin wood were mostly destroyed by the acid. The remains were buried in an unmarked grave. The government's extreme measures ensured that no physical memorial to Czolgosz could exist. His family never received his body, and the exact location of his burial site within the prison grounds was kept secret for decades. Gavrilo Princip. On April 28, 1918, 23-year-old Gavrilo Princip died in Theresienstadt Fortress Prison in Austria-Hungary. Princip had assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria 4 years earlier, the act that triggered World War I. On June 28, 1914, the 19-year-old Serbian nationalist had shot the Archduke and his wife in Sarajevo. Because Princip was only 19 years old at the time, just 27 days short of his 20th birthday, Austrian law prohibited his execution. Instead, he received the maximum sentence for a minor, 20 years in prison. Princip was sent to Theresienstadt Fortress, where conditions were deliberately harsh. The damp, cold cells were designed for suffering. Over the next 4 years, Princip's health deteriorated catastrophically. He developed skeletal tuberculosis, a disease where the infection attacks the bones themselves. The disease ate away at his skeleton. His right arm, the one that had fired the shots that killed the Archduke, became so diseased that surgeons amputated it in 1917. Despite the amputation, the tuberculosis continued spreading through his body. By early 1918, Princip weighed only 88 pounds. His body was wasting away, his bones literally being consumed by disease. On April 28, Gavrilo Princip died in his cell from tuberculosis and malnutrition. He was 23 years old. He died without knowing that World War I had ended 6 months later, or that his single act had contributed to a conflict that killed over 17 million people. Prison authorities buried him in an unmarked grave. After World War I, when his homeland became part of Yugoslavia, Princip was reburied with honors as a national hero. His legacy remains controversial, viewed as either a freedom fighter or a terrorist who sparked the deadliest war in history up to that point. Ignacy Hrnjevecki. On March 13, 1881, 25-year-old Ignacy Hrnjevecki stood on a St. Petersburg street, waiting for Tsar Alexander II's carriage. Ignacy was a member of the revolutionary group Narodnaya Volya, which had already made multiple attempts on the Tsar's life. The Tsar's carriage was bulletproof and heavily armored. Previous assassins had tried shooting him without success. Ignacy carried a bomb wrapped in a handkerchief, prepared to sacrifice his own life. Around 2:15 p.m., the Tsar's carriage passed along the Catherine Canal embankment. Another conspirator threw the first bomb, which exploded near the carriage, but failed to injure the Tsar. The explosion killed several Cossack guards and bystanders. Against his security detail's advice, Tsar Alexander II stepped out of his damaged carriage to check on the wounded guards and examine the damage. This was exactly what the assassins had anticipated. As the Tsar stood exposed on the street, Ignacy approached. He shouted, "It is too early to thank God," and threw his bomb directly between them, at their feet. The massive explosion tore through both men. The Tsar's legs were blown off, and his abdomen was ripped open. Ignacy was shredded by the blast, his body torn apart by the same bomb he had thrown. Both men lay dying on the blood-soaked street. The Tsar was carried to the Winter Palace, where he died within hours from massive blood loss. Ignacy died at the scene from his wounds. The assassin and his target died from the same explosion. Authorities identified Ignacy's body through documents in his clothing. His co-conspirators were hunted down, tried, and executed within weeks. The assassination led to increased repression in Russia, rather than the revolution Ignacy had hoped for. Otoya Yamaguchi. On November 2, 1960, 17-year-old Otoya Yamaguchi sat in his cell at a Tokyo juvenile detention facility. 3 weeks earlier, Yamaguchi had assassinated Inejiro Asanuma, chairman of the Japan Socialist Party, during a televised political debate. The teenage ultranationalist had rushed onto the stage at Tokyo's Hibiya Hall and stabbed Asanuma with a traditional Japanese wakizashi sword. The assassination was captured on camera by photographer Yasushi Nagao, who won the Pulitzer Prize for the image showing Yamaguchi's sword piercing the politician. Yamaguchi had been immediately arrested and charged with murder. As a minor, he could not face the death penalty. While awaiting trial, Yamaguchi showed no remorse for the killing, which he claimed was patriotic. On the evening of November 2nd, Yamaguchi began writing on his cell wall. He mixed water with toothpaste to create a white paste that he could use as paint. On the wall, he wrote, "7 lives for my country. Long live His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor." The message referred to the samurai tradition of being reborn 7 times to serve one's country. After finishing his wall inscription, Yamaguchi tore his bedsheet into strips. He tied the strips together to create a makeshift rope. He fastened one end to the light fixture in his cell and formed a noose with the other end. Otoya Yamaguchi hanged himself in his cell. He was discovered the next morning. He was 17 years old. His suicide transformed him into a martyr for Japan's far-right movement. His wall inscription was photographed and widely circulated. Decades later, right-wing groups in Japan continued to honor his memory, viewing his assassination of the socialist leader as a patriotic act. His grave in Tokyo became a pilgrimage site for ultranationalists, who saw him as a national hero rather than a murderer. Nathuram Godse. On November 15, 1949, 39-year-old Nathuram Godse was executed by hanging at Ambala Central Jail in India. Godse had assassinated Mahatma Gandhi on January 30, 1948, shooting the independence leader 3 times during evening prayers in New Delhi. Godse, a Hindu nationalist who edited a Marathi newspaper, believed Gandhi had betrayed India by supporting Pakistan and being too accommodating to Muslims. His trial became a major event, with Godse delivering lengthy speeches justifying the assassination as necessary to protect Hindu interests. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Before his execution, Godse made unusual final requests. He asked that his ashes not be immersed in a river, according to traditional Hindu funeral rites. Instead, he requested that his ashes be preserved until India and Pakistan were reunited as Akhand Bharti, meaning undivided India. This reunification, he believed, would vindicate his act of killing Gandhi, whom he blamed for the partition of India. On the morning of his execution, Godse walked calmly to the gallows. He reportedly smiled as the noose was placed around his neck. The trapdoor opened, and Nathuram Godse died by hanging. His body was cremated according to his wishes. His family took possession of his ashes and placed them in a silver urn. For over 7 decades, Godse's ashes have remained preserved in that urn, held by family members in Pune. The ashes have never been immersed because India and Pakistan remain separate nations. Godse's final wish meant his ashes would wait indefinitely for a reunification that shows no signs of occurring. His preserved remains became a symbol for Hindu nationalist movements in India. Some groups honor him as a patriot who acted to protect Hindu interests, while others view him as a fanatic who murdered the father of the nation. The ashes remain in family custody, awaiting a political change that may never come. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.